Barron Trump pretends to be a homeless teen at a school. The principal's move ends his job. It was a chilly morning when Barron Trump stood outside a public high school, dressed in a worn hoodie and faded jeans, a tattered backpack slung over his shoulder. His expression was somber, blending perfectly into the backdrop of the busy schoolyard. No one recognized him as the son of the former First Lady, and that was exactly what he wanted. For weeks, Barron had been troubled by stories about how homeless youth were mistreated by school authorities, and he was determined to experience it firsthand. He sat down quietly on the front steps of the school, his gaze fixed on the ground as students streamed past him, glancing curiously before hurrying along. The cold cement pressed against him, but Barron didn't flinch. This was his mission, to test the humanity and empathy of those in power at this school. The principal, Mr. Grayson, stepped outside, his sharp eyes scanning the scene. Dressed in a tailored suit and polished shoes, he exuded authority. His eyes landed on Barron, who remained seated, his expression calm but resolute. "Hey, you there?" Mr. Grayson barked, striding toward Barron. "This isn't a shelter. You can't just loiter around here." Barron raised his eyes slowly, locking gazes with the principal. "I'm not causing trouble, sir. I don't have anywhere else to go," he said softly, his voice carrying an edge of vulnerability that made the students nearby pause and glance back. But Mr. Grayson wasn't moved. He crossed his arms, tapping his foot impatiently. "You can't stay here. This is a school. We don't have resources for people like you." Barron felt the sting of the words, but he held his ground. "Please, just let me rest here for a while. I'll be quiet. No one will notice." The students whispered among themselves, watching the scene unfold. One girl stepped closer, concern flickering in her eyes. "Mr. Grayson, maybe we should help him? He looks like he's been through a lot." But Mr. Grayson waved her off. "Rules are rules. We can't let just anyone hang around. This isn't a charity." Barron sighed internally. He had hoped for compassion, but this was a test after all. He remained seated, letting the tension build, his eyes carefully studying Mr. Grayson's reaction. The principal leaned in, lowering his voice. "Listen, kid. If you don't leave right now, I'll have to call security. We can't have someone like you disrupting the school." Before Barron could respond, the door behind them opened, and Mrs. Hathaway, the school counselor, stepped out. Her eyes widened as she took in the scene. "What's going on here?" she asked, her voice calm but authoritative. Mrs. Hathaway quickly assessed the situation, her eyes flickering between the stern-faced principal and the boy sitting on the steps. There was something about the boy that tugged at her instincts. He didn't look like the typical runaway or troubled teen. His posture was too calm, his eyes too calculating, though hidden beneath a well-practiced mask of vulnerability. "Mr. Grayson," she said, crossing her arms, "this young man looks like he's in need of some help. Don't you think we should give him a chance to explain himself?" Mr. Grayson frowned, shifting uncomfortably under her scrutiny. "We have procedures, Mrs. Hathaway. It's not safe to let strangers hang around the school." "Procedures are important," she agreed, "but so is basic human decency." Barron watched the exchange, intrigued by the counselor's unexpected intervention. She seemed genuine, a rare trait in the world he had encountered so far during his undercover mission. He decided to lean into his role a little more, softening his voice and looking up at her with tired eyes. "I just need a place to rest for a bit. I won't bother anyone, I promise," he said, letting a slight tremble enter his voice. Mrs. Hathaway crouched down to his level, her expression kind and reassuring. "What's your name?" "Brandon," Barron said without hesitation, adopting an alias. "I've been on the street for a while now. Just trying to figure things out." The counselor nodded slowly. "Okay, Brandon. Why don't you come inside, and we'll find you something warm to drink." Mr. Grayson looked as if he might protest, but Mrs. Hathaway silenced him with a look. The murmuring students scattered as she guided Barron into the school building. As they walked down the hallway, Barron could feel the curious stares from students and teachers alike. He kept his head down, playing his part convincingly. Mrs. Hathaway led him into her office, a cozy space filled with books, inspirational quotes on the walls, and a steaming pot of tea on the corner table. She gestured for him to sit on the couch while she prepared 2 cups. "Here you go," she said, handing him a mug. "Now, tell me a little about your situation. Where are you from?" Barron hesitated, carefully crafting his story. "I used to live in the suburbs with my family, but things got rough. My mom, she lost her job, and everything spiraled from there. I've been on my own for a few months now." Mrs. Hathaway's eyes softened with sympathy. "That's incredibly brave of you. It must be hard." Barron nodded, sipping the tea. "It is, but I'm managing. I just needed a safe place for a little while." She leaned forward, her hands clasped together. "Brandon, we have programs and resources for kids in your situation. I can connect you with a shelter and some people who can help." Barron smiled faintly. "Thank you. I appreciate it." As their conversation continued, Mrs. Hathaway grew more and more convinced of his authenticity. She made a few calls, arranging for a local outreach program to visit the school and speak with him. Meanwhile, outside the office, Mr. Grayson paced nervously. He couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something about the boy was off, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. Determined to maintain control of the situation, he decided to take matters into his own hands. An hour later, Barron was still in Mrs. Hathaway's office when Mr. Grayson knocked on the door, his expression grim. "I just got off the phone with security," he said. "They'll be here soon to escort him off the premises." Mrs. Hathaway's eyes widened. "Security? Mr. Grayson, that's completely unnecessary. This young man isn't a threat." "I'm sorry, but we have to follow protocol. We can't take any risks," Mr. Grayson insisted. Before Mrs. Hathaway could argue further, the door opened and two security guards stepped inside. Barron remained calm, realizing the situation was escalating faster than he had anticipated. He had planned on quietly leaving after a few hours, but Mr. Grayson's decision had thrown a wrench in his plan. The guards approached, but Barron stood up and raised his hand. "No need for that. I'll go peacefully," he said with a faint smile. As he walked toward the door, Mrs. Hathaway followed, her concern evident. "Brandon, wait. We can figure this out." Barron turned to her, his expression unreadable. "It's okay, really. Thank you for your kindness. Not everyone would have shown me the same compassion." Mrs. Hathaway watched as he walked away, a sinking feeling in her chest. Something about the whole situation didn't sit right with her. Outside, Mr. Grayson smirked triumphantly as Barron exited the building. "Good riddance," he muttered under his breath. But Barron wasn't done yet. He walked a few steps before turning back, his voice loud enough to carry across the courtyard. "By the way, Mr. Grayson, you might want to rethink how you treat people. You never know who they might be." The students and staff who had gathered looked at each other in confusion, whispering among themselves. Mr. Grayson frowned, but before he could respond, Barron disappeared around the corner. The principal stood in stunned silence, unsure how to react to Barron's cryptic words. Mrs. Hathaway, still standing in the doorway of her office, narrowed her eyes as she watched him disappear from view. Something wasn't adding up, and her instincts told her that Brandon, or whoever he really was, hadn't told them everything. Mr. Grayson huffed and turned to the security guards. "Well, that's taken care of. Now, let's get back to business as usual." He strutted back toward his office, confident that he had restored order, completely unaware that his actions had set in motion something far bigger than he could control. Meanwhile, Barron walked down the street, his mind racing with thoughts. He had expected resistance from some of the staff at the school, but Mr. Grayson's quick judgment and harshness had surprised even him. He pulled out his phone, making a quick call. "It's me," Barron said quietly. "I've got everything I need. Time for the next step." On the other end of the line, a calm voice responded. "Good work. We'll meet tonight to go over the footage." He hung up and smiled to himself. This wasn't just a personal experiment. It was part of a larger investigation into how public institutions treated the most vulnerable members of society. His family had always believed in using their influence for good, and Barron was determined to play his part. This school was only the first stop on his list. The next morning, the school was buzzing with excitement. Word had spread quickly about the mysterious homeless teenager who had been escorted off campus, and everyone had their own version of the story. Some students whispered about how brave he seemed, while others speculated wildly about his true identity. In the principal's office, Mr. Grayson sat at his desk, basking in the temporary attention. He had always loved being at the center of school politics and power plays. His phone rang, interrupting his daydream. Mr. Grayson speaking, he answered confidently. "Good morning, Mr. Grayson," said an unfamiliar but authoritative voice. "This is Charles Hamilton from the governor's office. I'd like to schedule a meeting with you regarding an incident that occurred yesterday at your school." Mr. Grayson froze, his confidence evaporating. "The governor's office? Of course. What is this about?" "It concerns the young man who was removed from your premises. We believe it's in your best interest to cooperate fully." The line went dead before Mr. Grayson could respond. Panic gripped him as he tried to make sense of what was happening. Why would the governor's office care about a random homeless teenager? Later that afternoon, a black SUV pulled up in front of the school. Out stepped Charles Hamilton, accompanied by 2 assistants, their faces serious and unreadable. Mr. Grayson greeted them at the front entrance, trying his best to appear calm and collected. "Mr. Hamilton, welcome," he said, extending a hand. "Please, come into my office." Once inside, Mr. Hamilton wasted no time. "Mr. Grayson, we have reason to believe that the young man you removed from your school yesterday is not who you thought he was." Mr. Grayson's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" Hamilton leaned forward, his voice low but firm. "That young man was none other than Barron Trump, conducting an undercover investigation into how schools treat at-risk youth. The footage of your actions has already been reviewed by several key figures." The color drained from Mr. Grayson's face. "Be Barron Trump? Are you sure?" Hamilton nodded. "Absolutely. And what we've seen is deeply concerning. Your treatment of him, if it had been directed at any real homeless teenager, could have had devastating consequences. Your actions were callous and reckless." "I didn't know," Mr. Grayson stammered. "If I had known, I would have." "That's precisely the problem," Hamilton interrupted. "You shouldn't treat anyone that way, regardless of who they are. Barron's identity is irrelevant. What matters is how quick you were to dismiss and dehumanize someone in need." Mrs. Hathaway, who had been summoned to the meeting as well, crossed her arms and nodded in agreement. "I tried to tell him, Mr. Hamilton. I knew something was wrong with how he handled the situation." Hamilton turned back to Mr. Grayson. "Effective immediately, the governor's office will be launching a full investigation into your conduct. Until then, you are suspended from your duties." The room fell into a heavy silence. Mr. Grayson sank into his chair, his face pale and defeated. The weight of his actions pressed down on him like a crushing force. He had always believed he was untouchable, but now the truth had caught up with him in the most unexpected way. Outside the school, students and teachers gathered as the news spread like wildfire. Barron's undercover operation had not only exposed Mr. Grayson's behavior but also sparked a larger conversation about compassion and fairness in education. A sleek black car pulled up to the curb and Barron stepped out, his expression calm but resolute. The crowd parted as he made his way to the front steps of the school, where a group of reporters had already assembled. One reporter thrust a microphone toward him. "Barron, why did you decide to go undercover?" Barron paused, glancing at the crowd before answering. "I wanted to see how people in positions of power treat those who are vulnerable. What I experienced yesterday was eye-opening. It's a reminder that we all need to do better." Mrs. Hathaway stepped forward, placing a hand on his shoulder. "And some of us are ready to listen and learn." Barron smiled at her, grateful for her kindness. "I'm glad there are people like you in the world, Mrs. Hathaway." The crowd erupted into applause as Barron and Mrs. Hathaway stood side by side, a powerful symbol of change and hope for a better future. As the applause settled, the reporters began asking a flurry of questions. Barron raised his hand to signal for calm, his confident presence commanding the attention of everyone around him. He could feel the weight of the moment. This was more than just an exposé. It was an opportunity to drive change. "I didn't come here to humiliate anyone," Barron began. "I came to learn, to understand the challenges that vulnerable youth face in our society. What I discovered was heartbreaking. Too many people are quick to judge and dismiss those who appear to be struggling. But everyone deserves compassion, not judgment. One of the younger students standing in the crowd raised their hand timidly. "Does this mean Mr. Grayson won't be coming back?" Barron paused, choosing his words carefully. "That's up to the school board and the authorities. What's important is that this school, and all schools, learn from this experience. It's never too late to change and be better." The crowd murmured in agreement, and Barron felt a sense of satisfaction knowing that his words were resonating. Mrs. Hathaway stepped up beside him again, her eyes full of admiration. "You've inspired a lot of people today, Barron," she said softly. "Including me." Barron smiled, feeling a warm surge of gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without people like you standing up for what's right." At that moment, a middle-aged man in a sharp suit approached the podium. It was the chairman of the school board, Mr. Andrews. His expression was grave but determined. "Mr. Trump," he began, addressing Barron directly, "on behalf of the school board, I want to personally apologize for what happened. This incident has forced us to confront some uncomfortable truths about how we treat others. Effective immediately, we will be implementing new policies to ensure that every student, regardless of their background or circumstances, is treated with dignity and respect." The crowd erupted into applause once again, and Mr. Andrews extended his hand to Barron, who shook it firmly. "Thank you for your courage," Mr. Andrews added. "You've opened our eyes." As the crowd began to disperse, Barron found himself surrounded by students and teachers eager to speak with him. Some wanted to apologize for how they had treated him, while others simply wanted to express their admiration. Barron listened patiently, offering kind words and reassurances to everyone who approached him. But amidst the excitement, one figure stood quietly in the background, Mr. Grayson. His face was a mask of regret and humiliation as he watched the scene unfold. He knew there was no escaping the consequences of his actions, but deep down, a small part of him hoped for redemption. Summoning his courage, Mr. Grayson stepped forward, his voice trembling slightly. "May I speak with you for a moment?" The crowd fell silent as Barron turned to face him. The tension in the air was palpable. "I want to apologize," Mr. Grayson said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was wrong. I let my biases cloud my judgment, and for that, I am truly sorry." Barron studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, to everyone's surprise, he extended his hand. "We all make mistakes, Mr. Grayson," Barron said calmly. "What matters is what we do to make things right." Mr. Grayson hesitated before taking Barron's hand, a wave of relief washing over him. "Thank you. I promise to do better." The crowd watched in awe as the two shook hands, a powerful symbol of forgiveness and the possibility of change. As the sun began to set, Barron took one last look at the school. This was just the beginning of his mission, but today had proven that even the smallest actions could spark a movement. He knew there were still many challenges ahead, but for the first time in a long while, he felt hopeful. Mrs. Hathaway walked up beside him, her eyes sparkling with pride. "Where will you go next?" Barron smiled mischievously. "I have a few more places in mind. But first, I need a good meal." Mrs. Hathaway laughed. "Well, you've certainly earned it." They walked toward the parking lot together, the weight of the day lifting with each step. Barron knew his journey was far from over, but he also knew he wasn't alone. With allies like Mrs. Hathaway and countless others who believed in justice and compassion, he was ready to take on whatever came next. The warm glow of the streetlights flickered on as Barron and Mrs. Hathaway stepped out into the cool evening air. The hum of life surrounded them, students leaving the building, teachers exchanging last words, and the unmistakable sound of hope in the air. The day had taken a toll on Barron, but despite the exhaustion settling into his bones, a renewed sense of purpose carried him forward. "You know," Mrs. Hathaway said as they approached the sidewalk, "this could be the beginning of something much bigger. What you've done here today, it could change lives." Barron nodded thoughtfully, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I hope so. There's still so much work to do, and so many others out there who've been judged unfairly." Just then, a young boy from the school rushed up to him, clutching a small notebook. His wide eyes were filled with admiration. "Mr. Trump, I just wanted to say thank you. I've been bullied for months because my family doesn't have much. What you did today, it means a lot." Barron knelt down to meet the boy at eye level. "What's your name?" "Ryan," the boy said softly. "Well, Ryan," Barron said with a kind smile, "you're stronger than you realize. Don't let anyone make you feel like you're less than you are. You have more power than you know." Ryan grinned, his confidence visibly restored. "Thank you, sir." As Ryan ran back toward his waiting parents, Barron stood and turned to Mrs. Hathaway. "Every small victory matters," he said quietly. A black SUV pulled up to the curb and the driver stepped out, holding the door open for Barron. Mrs. Hathaway raised an eyebrow. "Looks like your ride's here." Barron chuckled. "I guess it's time to head home." He turned to face her one last time. "Thank you, Mrs. Hathaway. For believing in me. For standing up when it mattered most." "It was the least I could do," she replied. "And Barron, don't stop. The world needs more people like you." With that, Barron climbed into the SUV, and the door closed behind him. As the vehicle pulled away, he leaned back against the seat, the weight of the day finally catching up with him. The city lights blurred into streaks outside the window, but Barron's mind was already planning his next move. He knew there were more schools, more communities, and more people in need of a voice. And if today had proven anything, it was that one voice, no matter how young or unexpected, could ignite change. The SUV turned onto a quiet street, and Barron's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out to find a message from his mother. "Melania, proud of you, sweetheart. Come home. We'll celebrate together." A soft smile spread across Barron's face as he typed a quick response. "On my way." As the vehicle merged onto the highway, the skyline of the city stretched before him, a reminder of how vast the world was and how much work remained to be done. But for now, Barron allowed himself a moment of peace. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles to fight. But tonight, he was content to reflect on how far he had come. The driver glanced at him through the rearview mirror. "Big day, huh?" "You have no idea," Barron replied with a knowing grin. The SUV sped off into the night, and the stars above twinkled like beacons of possibility. For Barron, the journey was just beginning. The SUV cruised through the dimly lit streets, the city falling quieter as they left the bustling center behind. Barron leaned back in his seat, lost in thought. The events of the day replayed in his mind, each moment more vivid than the last. The outrage on the principal's face, the stunned silence of the staff, and most importantly, the glimmer of hope he had seen in the eyes of the students. His phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't his mother. "Unknown number, we saw what you did today. Let's talk soon. There's more to be done." Barron stared at the message for a moment, a sense of intrigue sparking in him. He didn't recognize the number, but the words resonated. He had always known that his path would take him beyond the confines of privilege and wealth. Today was just the first step towards something far greater. The SUV rolled to a stop in front of the Trump family residence. The grand facade stood tall and proud, but tonight, it seemed almost unassuming, a stark contrast to the life Barron had just experienced on the streets and in the halls of the school. The door opened, and the family's butler greeted him with a polite nod. "Welcome home, Mr. Trump." "Thanks, James," Barron said as he stepped out. He paused for a moment, looking up at the windows of the house. He wondered how many of the world's greatest changes had begun in quiet moments like this, small reflections that led to monumental actions. Inside, Melania was waiting for him in the sitting room. She looked up from her book, a warm smile spreading across her face as she saw him. "There's my hero," Barron chuckled, dropping his bag by the door. "Hardly a hero. Just trying to do the right thing." "You did more than that," she said, standing and walking over to him. "You gave those kids something they've never had before, someone who truly sees them." Barron hesitated, then nodded. "It felt right. But I couldn't have done it without Mrs. Hathaway. She stood with me when it mattered most." Melania placed a hand on his shoulder. "It's always the ones with quiet strength who make the biggest impact." They sat down together, the warm glow of the fireplace casting soft shadows around the room. Melania poured them both tea, her eyes thoughtful as she watched her son. "What's next for you?" Barron took a sip of his tea, his mind already racing with possibilities. "I don't know yet, but today showed me that there's a lot more to be done." So many people are stuck in places where they feel invisible, forgotten. Maybe I can help change that. Melania's eyes sparkled with pride. You will. I have no doubt. The quiet hum of the house wrapped around them like a comforting embrace. Outside, the world moved on, unaware of the conversation taking place within those walls. But Barron knew that conversations like this had the power to change everything. It only took one spark to start a fire, and tonight, the spark had been lit. A few moments later, Melania stood and kissed her son on the forehead. Rest, darling. Tomorrow is a new day. Barron watched her leave, his thoughts still swirling. He set his tea down and pulled out his phone, scrolling back to the message from the unknown number. His finger hovered over the reply button for a moment before he typed two simple words. Barron, let's talk. He hit send and leaned back, feeling the weight of possibility settle on his shoulders. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, that uncertainty felt exciting. Somewhere out there, new challenges were waiting, and Barron Trump was ready to meet them head-on.